The long chain of islands stretching along the eastern edge of Asia, known today as Japan, was not always inhabited by the people we now call Japanese. In very early times, the archipelago was home to a different population, a group often described as the Ainu. They were known for their heavy body hair and distinctive physical features, and their own word, Ainu, simply meant human being. Archaeological and historical interpretations suggest that thousands of years ago, waves of newcomers began arriving from the Asian mainland. These migrations did not occur all at once. Instead, they unfolded gradually over centuries, with small groups landing on different shores of the islands at different times. As these settlers spread through the archipelago, the earlier inhabitants were steadily pushed away from their original territories, retreating first toward the eastern regions and eventually to the colder northern lands. The precise homeland of these newcomers is still debated. Yet many scholars believe that the migrants most likely crossed the sea from the Asian continent through the Korean peninsula. The people who eventually formed the Japanese population were not identical to the Chinese, even though Chinese civilization later had a profound influence on them. In fact, the ancestral roots of the Japanese appear to lie somewhat farther north than the traditional homeland of the Han Chinese. At the same time, linguistic and cultural similarities show a clear connection between the Japanese and the Koreans. These connections suggest that both peoples may share distant ancestry with other populations that once lived across northern Asia. Over time, the population of the islands became a mixture of many groups. The people who would later be called Japanese were shaped by several different migrations. Some arrivals likely came from the eastern coasts of China, while others travelled northward from the islands of the southern seas. Occasionally, newcomers also crossed the waters from regions west of the Sea of Japan. Observers in later centuries sometimes tried to distinguish these various influences by physical appearance. One description suggested that the core Japanese type often showed an elongated face and a slightly curved nose. Features associated with continental influence were thought to include flatter facial structures and prominent cheekbones. Meanwhile, the southern element was sometimes described as having rounder faces and narrower eyes. Whether or not such distinctions were accurate, they reflect the long history of interaction between many different peoples in the region. Geography itself helps explain some of these influences. The western parts of the Japanese islands lie relatively close to the mouth of the Yangtze River, making travel across the sea easier in ancient times. Maritime routes allowed goods, ideas, and people to move back and forth between the continent and the islands. Meanwhile, traditions also speak of groups arriving from the far south. Early legends refer to fierce peoples known as the Falcon Men and the Bear People who periodically appeared in the southern regions of the archipelago. Stories about these groups often place them in the area of Satsuma, in southern Kyushu. Even local names sometimes seem to preserve echoes of these ancient traditions. Certain names connected with bears appear frequently in that region, while along the southern coasts of Shikoku, there are place names associated with horses. These coastal areas would have been natural landing points for travellers arriving by sea from the south. In addition to these early migrations, historical records from later centuries mention repeated arrivals of immigrants from China and Korea. These newcomers played an important role in spreading new technologies, cultural ideas, and forms of knowledge throughout the islands. Skills related to agriculture, metalworking, writing, and government administration were gradually introduced and adapted. Through these contacts, the society that emerged in Japan absorbed many outside influences while also shaping them into something distinct. Alongside historical speculation about migration, ancient Japanese traditions preserve their own stories about the origins of the islands and the people who lived there. According to these stories, the land itself was created by divine beings who descended from the heavens. Among the earliest deities were a pair of heavenly figures who gave birth to many divine children. One of these children became the radiant sun goddess, a powerful figure who ruled from the high heavens and eventually became the mythical ancestor of Japan's ruling family. In the stories, the sun goddess once looked down from the skies upon the islands below. The land appeared troubled and chaotic, filled with restless and unruly spirits who caused disorder throughout the country. To restore harmony, messages were sent, warning these beings to submit to heavenly authority. When the warnings failed, divine forces were dispatched to bring the land under control. Gradually, the rebellious powers were subdued, and the territories they ruled were surrendered to the heavenly order. Some of the spirits who resisted were said to be descendants of a storm deity, a brother of the sun goddess. These figures were believed to have ruled the coastal lands along the Sea of Japan, facing the shores of Korea. After the conflicts ended, the sun goddess chose to send her own grandson down from the heavens. His mission was to govern the islands and bring lasting order to the land. The heavenly descendant is said to have arrived on the island of Kyushu, descending upon a high mountain peak. From there, his followers settled in a region known as the land facing the sun along the Pacific coast. Interestingly, this same area contains many ancient burial mounds that have been uncovered by modern archaeology. Excavations have revealed artifacts from very early periods of Japanese history, hinting at the presence of powerful clans and emerging political structures. From this southern region, the movement of people and power slowly spread eastward along the coasts of the inland sea. The ultimate goal was the central region of the islands, later known as Yamato. According to tradition, this region was finally conquered by a leader remembered as Emperor Jimmu, the legendary founder of the imperial line. The journey was not easy. The stories describe encounters with strange opponents, bearing names such as Earth Spiders, 80 Owls, Long-Legged Warriors, and Fury Giants. Whether these names represent mythological creatures or symbolic references to rival tribes is uncertain. During these struggles, the followers of the heavenly line suffered an early defeat. The reason, the story says, was that they were fighting while facing the rising sun. After realizing this mistake, they changed their strategy and fought with the sun at their backs. In the end, they achieved victory and established themselves in the Yamato region, which remained the center of imperial authority for many centuries. The people who traced their ancestry to these conquerors came to be known as the Yamato people. Whatever historical truths may lie behind these legends, they shaped the identity of the early Japanese state. The ruling lineage believed that it descended directly from heavenly powers, and the sun goddess was honored as the divine ancestor of the imperial family. Over time, this belief became deeply embedded in the traditions of the land. The conquered populations were encouraged to accept these ideas as well, and many eventually did. These beliefs formed the foundation of the indigenous religious tradition, now known as Shinto. The early myths and genealogies that supported these ideas were eventually written down during the 8th century. The purpose of recording them was to preserve the sacred history of the ruling lineage and affirm the divine origin of the Yamato people. These records gathered together ancient oral traditions, stories about the creation of the world, and legends about the early rulers of the land. Although some elements were influenced by Chinese ideas, the core of the tradition remained distinctly Japanese. Beyond the official traditions, countless stories continued to circulate among the people. Many of them blended local folklore with mythic themes drawn from nature and daily life. Storytelling was deeply rooted in the culture, and imagination often transformed ordinary events into tales of spirits, heroes, and supernatural beings. Over time, new stories also entered Japan through contact with other lands, adding further layers to the evolving tradition. The natural environment of the islands played an important role in shaping these imaginative traditions. Japan's landscape is extraordinarily varied. Mountains rise steeply from narrow plains. Rivers cut through deep valleys, and forests cover large portions of the land. The climate ranges from the warm southern regions to the snowy north. Though the islands are relatively small compared with great continents, their landscapes contain remarkable diversity. Such surroundings easily inspire stories of hidden spirits and unseen worlds. Dense forests and misty waterfalls invite thoughts of wandering fairies. Clouds drifting through mountain valleys suggest the presence of heavenly beings. Dark lakes surrounded by towering cliffs can feel like the dwelling places of mysterious powers. In spring, the pale blossoms of cherry trees appear almost unreal, as though some unseen figure had scattered them across the branches. The red leaves of autumn maples seem like woven brocade draped over the hillsides. Even the delicate movements of butterflies in the evening air have been imagined as spirits dressed in colourful robes. In the high mountains where snow gathers on distant peaks, people have long imagined powerful deities dwelling beyond the reach of ordinary life. And far across the ocean horizon lies the mysterious realm of the Sea King, a place described in legend as a land of eternal green. These impressions of nature shaped the earliest poetry of Japan. Ancient songs celebrated the beauty of the changing seasons and expressed the emotions of love, longing, and loss. The poetry was simple in structure, yet deeply moving. It reflected a worldview in which human life and the natural world were closely intertwined. Natural forces were often described as if they possessed human feelings, while people themselves were seen as part of the living landscape around them. Because of this intimate relationship between humans and nature, the myths of Japan rarely separated the two completely. Natural phenomena might appear as divine beings, yet they still remained closely connected to the physical world from which they arose. This approach differs from some mythological traditions, in which the gods are portrayed almost entirely as human-like figures. In Japanese tradition, the link to the natural world was rarely forgotten. The mythology that developed from these ideas never formed a perfectly organized system. Instead, it consisted of many separate stories and themes woven together loosely. Some myths explained the origins of the world, while others focused on the deeds of particular deities or heroes. The imagination that produced these stories was often light and flexible, capable of creating vivid images without binding them into rigid structures. Later influences also shaped the development of Japanese myth and folklore. Among these influences, the arrival of Buddhism was especially important. When Buddhist teachings reached Japan, they brought with them a vast universe of stories, symbols, and cosmic visions that had developed across India and other parts of Asia. These traditions described immense heavenly realms filled with radiant beings, magnificent landscapes, and countless spiritual worlds. Such imagery expanded the imaginative horizons of Japanese storytelling. At the same time, the imported ideas did not remain unchanged. Japanese writers and storytellers adapted them to suit their own cultural temperament. Complex religious concepts were often transformed into simpler narratives that ordinary people could understand and enjoy. Many Buddhist tales told of the countless previous lives of enlightened beings. In these stories, the central figure might appear as a human, an animal, or even a plant, demonstrating compassion and wisdom in many different forms of existence. These narratives spread widely through sermons and popular storytelling, encouraging people to see moral lessons in the behavior of animals and the events of everyday life. Japanese folklore did not grow in isolation. A large part of its narrative world was enriched by stories that had travelled across Asia, especially through the spread of Buddhism. Many tale patterns that once moved from India into the Buddhist world eventually took root in Japan so deeply that later generations came to think of them as native stories. Some entered through religious teaching, some through sermons, some through popular retellings, and over time they lost any obvious foreign identity. What mattered was not where they had first begun, but how completely they were absorbed into Japanese imagination. Along with these imported plot lines came something even more influential: a broader way of seeing life, nature, and the invisible ties between all beings. Buddhist thought encouraged a view of existence in which nothing stood entirely alone. Human beings, animals, plants, mountains, streams, even things that seemed silent or motionless, were all linked within one vast living order. Individual forms might appear separate, but beneath the surface they belong to a deeper continuity. This outlook helped shape a remarkable sympathy in Japanese storytelling. The world was not imagined as a collection of isolated objects, but as a field of relationships in which life passed from one form into another and moral actions echoed far beyond the moment in which they were committed. The spiritual goal within Buddhism was not merely personal salvation in a narrow sense. It also involved awakening to this profound unity and living with compassion toward every form of existence. This sense of connection was made even more immediate by the idea of karma. Life was understood as part of an endless moral chain in which present circumstances emerged from earlier actions and in turn shaped the future. No life stood by itself. Every experience belonged to a longer sequence, stretching backward beyond memory and forward beyond death. Yet karma did not apply only to the individual. It also worked across relationships. Human lives were thought to intersect for reasons deeper than chance. Parents and children, husbands and wives, friends, strangers, even brief encounters between passing people could be understood as signs of older ties carried over from previous existence. In this view, the world of human relationships became rich, with hidden continuity. That same idea extended outward into the natural world. The setting of human life was not spiritually empty. A bird singing in a branch, a butterfly drifting through flowers, dew resting on a lotus leaf, all could be felt as participating in the same web of being. The beauty of such moments was not merely decorative. It hinted at a relationship between the observer and the observed. This way of thinking gave Japanese literature and folklore a deep emotional sensitivity toward the natural world. Nature was not scenery in the background. It was a partner in existence, bound to human feeling through invisible threads of affinity. Buddhist tales strengthened this imagination still further. In countless narratives, enlightened beings were said to have passed through many forms of life before attaining full awakening. A holy figure might once have lived as a deer, a bird, a monkey, or some humble creature of the wild. In other stories, people recalled former lives in which they had moved through forests, fields, and skies in shapes very different from their present human form. Such stories invited listeners to look at animals and plants with fresh intimacy. A bird in the trees might not be only a bird. A flower might conceal an older bond. A meeting in this life could be the continuation of something begun long ago. As Buddhism widened the emotional and spiritual horizons of folklore, Taoism added a different kind of imaginative energy. If Buddhism emphasized compassion, continuity, and moral consequence, Taoism opened the door to mystery, wonder, and supernatural freedom. It came into Japan from China carrying a powerful attraction toward the wildness of nature and toward forms of existence not bound by ordinary human limits. Taoist thought often turned away from social duty and human convention, seeking instead a return to a freer and more elemental life. Its ideal figure was the sage who withdrew from the noise of society and entered into harmony with mountains, mists, winds, and hidden powers. This ideal gave rise to the image of the immortal wanderer, the mountain being who moved through the natural world untouched by age and unconstrained by the ordinary rules of life. Such figures were believed to travel through the air, dwell among remote peaks, feed on dew and mist, and achieve extraordinary powers through discipline and spiritual attainment. In the Japanese imagination, this kind of being became a familiar presence. The mountain hermit, the hidden holy man, the mysterious recluse living close to the heart of the natural world all belong partly to this Taoist inheritance. Their miracles did not seem out of place in a landscape already filled with sacred groves, deep valleys, and mist-covered ridges. Over time, these Taoist ideas blended with Buddhist thought and with older native beliefs. The result was a rich body of stories in which supernatural beings appeared not in distant heavens alone, but in forests, on mountainsides, beside streams, or within lonely natural places. A spirit might be a transformed human being. A hermit might possess powers gained through religious discipline. A natural feature might conceal an intelligence or presence older than memory. In such stories, nature was alive not only with beauty, but with hidden personalities and forces. Yet not every influence encouraged the growth of fantasy. Another current of thought, Confucianism, often worked in the opposite direction. Confucian teaching valued order, reason, hierarchy, discipline, and moral conduct within society. It directed attention toward family duty, political ethics, and practical behavior rather than towards supernatural wonder. In this framework, imagination had limited value unless it served social and moral order. Myths, marvelous tales, and wandering legends were easily treated as distractions or as childish material, unworthy of serious attention. This more sober intellectual attitude eventually became very influential in Japan, especially among educated and governing circles. For long periods, refined society judged folk tradition from above and often dismissed it. Romantic tales, village legends, and supernatural stories were not always considered proper subjects for serious thought. During the centuries when Confucian ethics dominated elite culture, this attitude placed a clear restraint on the free growth of imaginative literature. The pressure was real, and it shaped literary taste, education, and moral standards. Even so, it never erased the older narrative world. The stories survived among the people. Legends remained alive in shrines, villages, family traditions, seasonal customs, and oral storytelling. Beneath the polished surface of official morality, a vast body of myth and folklore continued to circulate. In that sense, Japan preserved an extraordinarily rich, imaginative inheritance. It endured not because it was always encouraged by formal learning, but because it remained woven into memory, ritual, and the emotional life of ordinary people. The stories that emerged from this long development can be understood in several broad groups. Some explain how the world began, how lands, gods, customs, or natural features came into being. Others belong to the realm of pure fantasy, where imagination moves freely through fairy tales, spirits, strange transformations, and marvelous journeys. A third group centers on human feeling and dramatic action, especially love, loyalty, courage, and heroic struggle. A fourth includes stories meant to teach, whether through fables, moral examples, satire, or humor. These categories often overlap, but together they reveal the range of Japanese mythic thought. At the heart of the oldest tradition lies a distinctive view of origins. In Japanese myth, the universe is not usually brought into being by the command of a single creator speaking the world into existence. Instead, life begins through emergence and growth. things come forth by themselves, unfold in sequence, and develop through generation. This is an important difference. A created world depends absolutely on the will of a supreme maker. A world born through spontaneous arising suggests that vitality already lives within existence itself. This older Japanese outlook gave shape to Shinto belief and later blended naturally with Buddhist ideas about the living continuity of all things. There was, however, a difference between native Shinto thought and Buddhist philosophy. In older Shinto imagination, changes in the world could happen through the mysterious power of a deity, or through sudden transformation. In Buddhism, change was tied more strictly to causation. Nothing happened without a reason, whether physical or moral. But in popular belief, these two ways of thinking gradually drew closer. Transformations remained wondrous, yet people also came to feel that everything was connected through hidden causes. From this mixture grew a widespread belief that all things possess inner vitality and that everything may change according to its own nature and the forces acting around it. This idea forms the foundation of many Japanese myths. In the beginning, according to ancient tradition, there was a formless chaos, often imagined as a vast oily sea without fixed shape. Out of that undivided expanse, something first stirred, like a reed shoot rising from the waters. From this earliest movement emerged divine beings, including a primal triad who stood at the very beginning of existence. They do not play a dramatic role in later myth, yet they mark the first stage in the unfolding of the cosmos. After them came other deities, often appearing in pairs, associated with growth, generation, and the hidden forces by which things take form. These early beings pass quickly from view, and eventually attention shifts to the divine pair who become central to the story of creation. These are Izanagi and Izanami, the male and female powers whose union gives shape to the world. Sent down from the heavenly realm, they stand above the formless waters and stir the sea with a jeweled spear. The drops that fall from its tip harden into an island, and upon that first island they descend. There they circle around in opposite directions, meet, and begin the work of generation. From their union come the islands of Japan and a long succession of natural powers and divine beings associated with winds, mountains, rivers, trees, plains, and all the visible features of the land. At first, the process is one of growth and creation, but then the pattern changes. When Izanami gives birth to the fire deity, she is fatally burned and dies. With her death, something entirely new enters the mythic order. Until that point, the unfolding of existence had been a movement of generation alone. Now, death appears, and from that moment, the universe is divided. Life and death, light and darkness, order and destruction begin to stand against one another. Izanagi cannot accept the loss and descends into the land of the dead in search of his wife. But the realm he enters is a place of corruption and decay. When he sees Izanami in her ruined state, horror replaces longing. She's enraged by his violation of her command not to look upon her, and she pursues him with dreadful beings from the underworld. He narrowly escapes and seals the entrance between the worlds with a great stone. At that boundary, the two exchange terrible words. She declares that she will claim lives each day from the world above, and he replies that more lives will be born in answer. In this confrontation, the balance between birth and death is established. After escaping the defilement of the underworld, Izanagi purifies himself in flowing water. From this act of purification, new divine beings are born, including the sun goddess, the moon god, and the storm god. Their appearance begins the next great movement in the mythic cycle, where the conflicts of the cosmos are no longer only about creation and death, but about rule, order, and the struggle between harmony and violence. The sun goddess shines with dignity and radiance. She represents order, brightness, and rightful authority. The storm god is wild, destructive, and uncontrollable. Though entrusted with his own domain, he does not govern it well. Instead, he rages, causes disorder, and destroys what has been carefully arranged. In him, the force of chaos takes a personal form. The conflict between these divine siblings becomes one of the central dramas of Japanese mythology. At one point, the storm god approaches the heavenly realm of his sister, and she prepares to meet him in arms, suspecting treachery. He insists that he has come in peace. Their brief reconciliation is marked by an exchange of sacred objects from which new beings are born. Yet the peace does not last. Soon he returns to his old violence, wrecking fields, desecrating sacred spaces, and unleashing disorder so severe that the sun goddess withdraws into a cave. With her disappearance, the world is plunged into darkness. The image is one of the most powerful in Japanese myth. Light hidden away, the universe darkened, and destructive forces rising in the absence of order. To bring her back, the assembled gods gather before the cave and devise a plan. They prepare sacred objects, hang ornaments upon a tree, light fires, and perform rituals. Most memorable of all is the dance that provokes such laughter among the gods, that the hidden goddess becomes curious. When she peers out, she is drawn forth, and light returns to the world. The darkness ends not in final catastrophe, but in restoration. That pattern is typical. In Japanese myth, conflict often leads not to absolute destruction, but to renewed balance. The storm god is punished and cast out. In later stories, he wanders, fights monsters, and becomes connected with distant regions, forests, and strange local traditions. In one famous episode, he kills a many-headed serpent and discovers within its tail a sacred sword, one of the treasures later associated with royal authority. In this way, even a violent and disruptive deity becomes part of the larger sacred order. His legacy continues most strongly in the land of Izumo, where later myths place another major figure, the great landmaster. He is a builder, organizer, and ruler associated with the shaping and development of the land. Beside him appears a remarkable little deity, small in body but immense in power and knowledge. Together, they cultivate the country, discover remedies, and help establish the order of earthly life. Even here, myth blends practical concerns with sacred imagination. Agriculture, healing, settlement, and rulership all appear under divine forms. Eventually, the descendants of the sun goddess seek to extend their authority over these lands. The result is not an endless war of total destruction, but a negotiated settlement. The visible world and public rule are handed over to the heavenly line, while the hidden powers of magic, healing, and secret knowledge remain with the line of Izumo. This is a revealing conclusion. Instead of absolute dualism, the myth settles into shared domains. The world is divided, but not broken beyond repair. Order is achieved through compromise, and both visible power and hidden mystery find a place within the structure of existence. Many smaller myths also explain particular customs, natural phenomena, or human conditions. One story tells how food enters the world through a divine being whose body becomes the source of crops and animals. Another explains why the sun and moon do not appear together as equal companions. Another connects agricultural rites with purity and ritual offense. Others turn mountain landscapes, blossoms, autumn leaves, and seasonal beauty into divine personalities. In these stories, poetry and belief meet directly. A flowering tree becomes a goddess. A red maple hillside becomes woven brocade. The landscape itself speaks through myth. Even the stars enter the story in transformed and romantic ways. A tale that came from China, about two lovers separated by the river of heaven and permitted to meet only once a year, became so fully at home in Japan that it was cherished as part of seasonal custom. The festival associated with these stars drew women and girls into acts of prayer, decoration, and longing. Here again, a borrowed narrative became inseparable from Japanese emotional life. That is the larger pattern across the whole tradition. Foreign stories were not merely copied, they were absorbed, reshaped, and felt until they became part of the living texture of the culture itself. Early Japanese belief was deeply shaped by the idea that spirits lived within nature and within human beings. Yet surprisingly, the oldest traditions do not spend much time explaining the soul in detail. Instead, they present only brief hints about its nature. In these ancient ideas, the human spirit was imagined as something light and mobile, almost like a small sphere or breath of energy. The Japanese word associated with the soul suggests something moving like wind within a small rounded form. According to these early views, the spirit contained two different qualities. One aspect was calm, gentle, and harmonious. This part remained closely connected with the body and the everyday life of the person. The other aspect was restless, powerful, and unpredictable. This second force could move beyond the body and act independently. In some legends, it was believed that extraordinary individuals possessed a particularly strong version of this roaming spirit. One tale tells of a powerful ruler who once encountered his own wandering spirit approaching from the sea. Rather than being frightened, he recognized that this untamed part of himself was responsible for many of his achievements and abilities. Whether all people were believed to possess such a divided spirit remains uncertain. The old traditions do not clearly say. What they suggest instead is that the soul was never entirely confined within the physical body. It could exist partly beyond it, extending into unseen realms. At the same time, the ancient records give little explanation about where the spirit finally went after death. Some traditions speak of distant realms, where spirits might dwell, but the earliest beliefs seem to imagine the soul remaining close to the world of the living for some time. One of the most familiar destinations mentioned in early stories is the dark land associated with death, a shadowy realm separated from the living world. Opposed to this gloomy domain is the bright region of the heavens, where divine beings rule. Yet many older traditions did not insist that every soul immediately entered one of these distant places. Instead, people believed that the spirit of the dead might linger near familiar surroundings, remaining close to the places and people that had shaped its life. Over time, however, Japanese ideas about the soul became more detailed. Influences from China and especially from Buddhism gradually reshaped these beliefs. Chinese philosophy introduced the concept that the spirit was composed of two forces connected with cosmic balance. One was heavy and material, while the other was light and ethereal. These ideas linked the fate of the soul to natural forces and to the place where a person was buried. Yet although these theories were known in Japan, they did not shape popular imagination as strongly as the teachings that came with Buddhism. Buddhism brought a far more elaborate picture of the soul's journey. Instead of imagining the spirit resting permanently in one place, Buddhist thought described existence as a long chain of rebirths. What continued from life to life was not a fixed soul in the strict sense, but the momentum created by a person's actions and character. Moral choices left traces that shaped future experiences. In this way, life flowed forward through an endless cycle of transformation. Stories inspired by this teaching often describe the spirit moving through many possible realms. A soul might rise into heavenly worlds, fall into dark regions of suffering or return again to the human world. Between these states, there were believed to be transitional stages where wandering spirits might appear among the living. Tales of ghostly encounters became extremely common in Japanese storytelling. These spirits were not always evil. Often they were simply lost, uncertain of their direction, or drawn back by powerful emotions left unresolved in life. One famous story describes a mysterious river encountered after death. At its bank, the spirit must decide which path to follow. Because several roads begin there, the river became known as the River of Three Ways. Each road leads toward a different form of existence. One descends toward the painful realms of punishment. Another leads toward rebirth among animals. The third moves toward a shadowy existence among restless spirits who wander in hunger and longing. Along these paths, the soul encounters judges who examine its past actions. These figures are imagined as stern guardians of moral balance. They question the spirit and measure the weight of its deeds. In the darkest realms stands a powerful judge who delivers final decisions about punishment and rebirth. Scenes of this spiritual judgment became common subjects in religious paintings, where the torments of the underworld were shown in vivid detail. Such images reminded people that every action carried consequences beyond the visible world. Yet not every spirit was destined for extreme reward or punishment. Many stories describe a more uncertain state in which the soul remains suspended between worlds. Spirits in this condition appear in ghostly form, pale and incomplete, often without fully formed bodies. These apparitions are drawn toward those they once loved, or those they once hated. Sometimes they return out of affection, longing to remain near family members. At other times, they appear driven by unresolved anger or desire for revenge. In countless legends, these wandering figures step briefly into the human world before fading again into the invisible. Among the most touching stories about the afterlife are those concerning the spirits of children who died too young. According to popular belief, their souls gather in a lonely riverbed filled with sand and small stones. The place is bleak and silent, far removed from the warmth of home. There, the children play together while waiting for a future they do not fully understand. Although separated from their parents, they still remember them with affection. The children spend their time stacking stones into small towers, imitating sacred monuments they once saw among the living. As they build these fragile structures, they whisper prayers for the happiness of their families. One tower is raised for a father, another for a mother, another for brothers and sisters left behind. Their innocent voices echo softly across the empty landscape. But these fragile towers are often destroyed by harsh spirits who roam the barren ground. The children scatter in fear, unable to protect their small creations. At that moment, a compassionate guardian appears. This protector is imagined as a gentle figure who cares especially for young souls. Wherever he walks, flowers bloom beneath his steps. He gathers the frightened children into the folds of his robes, shielding them from danger. Some cling to his sleeves, others are lifted into his arms. Under his protection, their sorrow is eased, and they find comfort in his kindness. Alongside these ideas about wandering spirits and intermediate states, Buddhism also introduced visions of perfect spiritual realms. These were not temporary heavens gained through ordinary rebirth, but ideal worlds created by enlightened beings to welcome their followers. Such realms were imagined as places of beauty and serenity, beyond suffering. One of the most widely imagined of these worlds was the Pure Land, a paradise of endless light and peace. In descriptions of this realm, lakes are filled with luminous waters and lotus flowers bloom in brilliant colours. Trees shimmer with jewel-like leaves, and gentle music drifts through the air. celestial beings float above the landscape, scattering blossoms, while radiant teachers guide the faithful toward awakening. Images of this paradise spread widely in art and storytelling, shaping how people imagined ultimate salvation. Another spiritual realm was associated with a future enlightened teacher who was believed to be preparing to appear in a distant age. His heaven was seen as a place where souls might wait before entering final enlightenment. Stories occasionally tell of travelers who briefly glimpse this realm during mystical journeys. A third vision described enlightenment not as a distant paradise, but as a transformation of the present world itself. In this idea, awakening allowed a person to perceive reality differently, seeing sacred meaning in every living thing. Mountains, animals, flowers, and even simple landscapes could reveal spiritual truth. This outlook helped deepen the Japanese tendency to see nature itself as a source of wisdom and wonder. Within the vast Buddhist universe, countless spirits were believed to exist. Some were benevolent protectors who defended the world against harmful forces. Among the most important were 4 mighty guardians who watched over the 4 directions of the universe. They were imagined as powerful warriors standing at the edges of the world, armed with weapons and trampling down demons that threaten peace. Each of these guardians protected a different quarter of the heavens. One watched the eastern horizon, another stood over the southern lands, another guarded the west, and the last defended the north. Their figures appeared frequently in temples, carved or painted as towering warriors, surrounded by swirling energy. People prayed to them for protection against illness, misfortune, and unseen dangers. Among them, the Northern Guardian eventually became especially popular and was sometimes associated with good fortune and prosperity. These protective figures existed alongside older Chinese cosmological symbols that represented the balance of natural forces across the universe. In that tradition, each direction was linked with a creature embodying a cosmic element. A red bird represented the fiery energy of the south. A dark tortoise symbolized the cold and watery north. An azure dragon stood for the renewing vitality of the east, while a white tiger embodied the sharp power of autumn in the west. In Japan, these symbolic animals were known but remained distinct from the warrior guardians of Buddhist belief. Beyond these cosmic ideas, countless legends grew from the landscapes of Japan itself. The islands are shaped by mountains and rivers that divide the land into many valleys and coastal regions. Each place developed its own traditions, shaped by local geography and community memory. A cliff, a lake, a waterfall, or a forest might become the setting for a story explaining how it came to be. In ancient times, the land was divided among clans whose identities were closely tied to particular territories. Each community honored its own ancestral spirit or protective deity. Shrines were often built in places considered sacred by tradition. These were sometimes located within forests, beside springs, or near unusual rocks or ancient trees. Such places served as centers of community life where people gathered during festivals, prayed for rain, or offered thanks for harvests. A sacred site might not require a large structure. Sometimes a simple rope hung with white paper marked a tree or stone as holy ground. The presence of a spirit was believed to linger there. Stories attached themselves to these places and were passed down from generation to generation. Even today, many landscapes across Japan remain connected to these old traditions. One ancient legend describes how a region along the Sea of Japan gained its distinctive shape. Long ago, a powerful ruler looked across the sea and saw distant land that seemed unused. Desiring to enlarge his own territory, he cast a rope across the water and pulled the distant land toward him. Piece by piece, he drew sections of coast and islands until they joined his own shore. The ropes used in this act were said to remain along the beaches, forming long stretches of sand. In this way, the shape of the land itself became part of mythic memory. Other stories connect places to the wanderings of powerful deities. One tale tells how a storm god once encountered a grieving couple, whose daughter was destined to be sacrificed to a terrible dragon. The god defeated the monster and married the rescued girl. As he travelled through the region searching for a place to celebrate the wedding, he declared one valley so beautiful that his heart felt refreshed there. The name of the region was said to come from those words. Many stories explain unusual natural features through acts of kindness, miracles, or divine encounters. A famous monk wandering through the countryside might reward a hospitable villager by striking the ground and causing a spring of clear water to emerge. A warrior praying for relief from thirst during a campaign might pierce a rock with an arrow and release a hidden fountain. Hot springs, strange rock formations, and unusual plants all became subjects of similar tales. Some legends explain why certain animals are absent from particular places. Others describe how magical teachers punished those who lied or refused hospitality. In one story, a farmer claimed that his potatoes were too hard to eat in order to avoid sharing them with a traveller. After hearing this excuse, the traveller declared that the potatoes would indeed remain hard forever. From that day forward, the soil of that village was said to produce nothing but stone-like crops. Many legends are connected with trees, especially ancient pines growing near the sea or on lonely hillsides. Sometimes, two trees standing side by side are said to represent lovers, whose devotion transformed them into living symbols of eternal affection. In another tale, a tree bends all its branches toward a distant capital, because a young woman once stood beneath it, gazing toward her lost home after being carried far away from her family. Across Japan, many legends grew around unusual rocks and natural formations. These features often inspired stories that blended memory, emotion, and imagination. One of the most famous examples is a rock standing on the western coast of Kyushu, near the port of Matsura, a place that once served as a departure point for ships sailing toward China. According to an old tale, a nobleman from the imperial court was once ordered to travel overseas on an official mission. His wife, a woman named Sayohime, accompanied him to the coast to say farewell. Together, they stood on the shore as the ship slowly moved away from land. She watched the vessel grow smaller and smaller until it finally vanished beyond the horizon. Refusing to leave the shore, she remained there waving her scarf toward the distant sea, hoping for one last glimpse of the man she loved. She stood there so long, lost in grief and longing, that her body was gradually transformed into stone. The rock that stands at Matsura today is said to be the figure of Sayohime herself. A strange projection from the rock is believed to be the arm with which she waved her final farewell. Natural events such as storms and winds also became the subjects of legend. One story attempts to explain the violent seasonal winds that strike Lake Biwa in autumn. The storm is known locally as the Hira hurricane, named after the Hira mountain range that rises steeply along the western side of the lake. Long ago, a young man lived alone on a narrow promontory on the eastern shore. His duty was to maintain a lighthouse that guided boats across the water. On the opposite side of the lake, in a small village, lived a beautiful young woman. One day she visited the promontory and saw the lighthouse keeper. The two quickly fell in love, but they agreed that their meetings must remain secret. Every night the girl crossed the wide lake in a small boat to meet him. The journey was dangerous, but she never failed to arrive safely because the lighthouse shone brightly through the darkness and guided her path. Whether the lake was calm and the moon reflected gently on the rippling water, or whether the wind stirred the waves into restless motion, the steady light always showed her where to go. Through the summer months, their secret meetings continued, night after night. As autumn approached, however, something began to trouble the young man. The courage and determination of the girl seemed almost unnatural. She crossed the lake without fear of storms, darkness, or discovery. Gradually, a strange suspicion formed in his mind. He began to wonder whether she was truly human. Perhaps she was a supernatural being, a dragon maiden from the depths of the water, or even a dangerous spirit in disguise. Determined to test the truth, he decided to see whether she could still find her way without the lighthouse guiding her. One night, before she began her journey, he extinguished the light. As usual, the girl had already set out in her small boat, but when the guiding beam suddenly disappeared, she quickly lost her direction. The dark waters stretched endlessly around her. She rowed in confusion, uncertain where she was or which way to go. Panic slowly overtook her. Believing that her lover had betrayed her, she cried out in despair. Grief and terror overwhelmed her thoughts. In that moment, she cursed him, cursed herself, and cursed the world that had led her to this fate. Finally, exhausted and hopeless, she threw herself into the dark waters. As she sank beneath the surface, she prayed that a violent storm would rise and destroy the lighthouse forever. Almost immediately, the wind began to howl across the lake. Waves rose violently, and the storm grew stronger as the night continued. By morning, the lighthouse had vanished. The structure and the young keeper who lived there had both been swallowed by the water. Since that time, people say that every year on a certain day, in the 8th lunar month, a fierce storm sweeps across Lake Biwa. It blows down from the slopes of the Hira Mountains, where the girl once lived, and so the storm came to be known as the Hira Hurricane. Stories of this kind form only one part of the rich world of Japanese folklore. For centuries, people believed that unseen spirits moved constantly through nature and human life. Spirits were thought to inhabit trees, rivers, mountains, and even the winds. The souls of the dead were also believed to remain active. Yet the earliest traditions of the country contain surprisingly few detailed descriptions of fantastic creatures or magical beings. In early religious records, many divine figures appear only as names. Others were honoured simply as the ancestors of powerful clans. The stories connected with them were often treated as historical events, rather than imaginative myths. This approach developed partly because early chroniclers wished to create official histories that could rival the ancient historical traditions of China. As a result, many legendary events were written in a sober and factual style, presenting myths as if they were real historical records. Even so, imagination never disappeared from Japanese storytelling. Beneath the surface of the official narratives, there existed a large body of tales about fairies, spirits, and supernatural beings. Many of these stories circulated among the people through oral tradition and popular literature. A large number of them were influenced by ideas that arrived from the Asian mainland. Chinese literature contributed many stories shaped by Taoist thought, while Indian myths reached Japan through Buddhist texts that had been translated into Chinese. The Japanese talent for storytelling often appeared not in inventing entirely new legends, but in adapting these foreign tales to local landscapes and traditions. Over time, the borrowed elements blended with older native beliefs, creating a distinctive world of folklore that felt uniquely Japanese. Among the supernatural beings associated with the natural world was a figure connected with the blooming of cherry trees. She was known as the lady who makes the blossoms open. In legend, she floats through the sky during springtime and causes the cherry trees to burst into flower, perhaps simply by breathing gently upon their branches. In myth, she eventually marries a descendant of the sun goddess, creating a symbolic union between heavenly beauty and the human world. Another well-known story tells of a mysterious celestial maiden sometimes called the Swan Maiden. In this tale, a group of heavenly women descend to earth and bathe in a clear spring. Before entering the water, they hang their feathered robes in the branches of nearby trees. These robes allow them to fly back to the sky. A man passing through the forest sees the garments and secretly hides one of them. When the maidens discover what has happened, they quickly take their robes and fly away. But the maiden whose robe was stolen cannot follow them. Unable to return to the sky, she remains on Earth and eventually marries the man who took her robe. For a time, the couple lives together peacefully and a child is born. But one day, the celestial woman discovers the hidden robe. As soon as she recovers it, she places it upon her shoulders and rises into the sky, leaving her earthly family behind forever. A more poetic version of this story appears in traditional theatre. In that version, a heavenly maiden descends to a beautiful pine forest near the sea, where the distant slopes of Mount Fuji rise beyond the water. A fisherman passing through the forest discovers a shimmering robe hanging from a branch. When the maiden appears and asks for its return, he refuses, fascinated by the miraculous object. She pleads with him, explaining that without it, she can never return to the heavens. Finally, she promises to perform a celestial dance if he agrees to give it back. As she dances, music fills the air as if invisible instruments are playing from the clouds. Her movements are described as graceful beyond human ability, a performance that seems to belong to another world. When the dance ends, the fisherman returns the robe. The maiden places it upon her body, rises slowly into the sky, and disappears among the clouds above Mount Fuji. Another famous legend tells of a mysterious princess, known as the Lady of Radiant Light. An old bamboo cutter once discovered a tiny shining girl hidden inside a bamboo stalk. He and his wife raised the child as their own daughter. As she grew older, her beauty became famous across the land, and many noble men asked for her hand in marriage. Rather than choosing a husband immediately, she challenged each suitor with an impossible task. One was asked to bring a legendary jewel from distant lands. Another to find a sacred object said to exist only in ancient stories. Each man attempted the challenge, but none succeeded. When they returned with clever excuses or false treasures, the maiden saw through their deception and rejected them all. Even the emperor heard of her beauty and invited her to live in the imperial palace, but she refused. Instead, she sent him poems and letters. For a time, this exchange brought the ruler comfort. Then one night, the truth was revealed. The maiden explained that she was not truly human. She belonged to the celestial realm of the moon and had been allowed to live on Earth only for a limited time. On the night of the autumn full moon, a glowing cloud descended from the sky. Soldiers sent to guard the house suddenly found themselves unable to move, or even lift their weapons. The heavenly beings gently carried the maiden away, returning her to the palace of the moon. She left behind a letter and a box of magical medicine. When the emperor later climbed to the summit of Mount Fuji, he ordered the medicine burned in grief. According to the legend, the smoke that rises from the mountain was born from that moment. Stories of supernatural brides were not limited to the sky. Many tales describe maidens from the depths of the ocean who marry human men. In these stories, the mortal often visits the underwater world rather than the maiden coming to land. Yet such marriages rarely last. Eventually, the human being longs to return to the surface world, or a promise is broken that forces the lovers to part forever. These legends often describe a magnificent realm beneath the sea. Time flows differently there, and when a human visitor returns home, he may discover that centuries have passed. One of the most famous tales of this kind is the story of a fisherman named Urashima. One day, While sailing across the water, he encountered a beautiful young woman who invited him to visit her home beneath the sea. Following her, he entered a palace made of shining coral and crystal. The woman revealed that she was the daughter of the Dragon King who ruled the ocean. Urashima married her and lived happily in the underwater kingdom. After several years, he began to miss his parents and wished to visit his homeland. His wife reluctantly agreed and gave him a small box. She warned him never to open it. When he returned to his village, however, everything had changed. His home had vanished and no one recognized his name. People told him that a fisherman called Urashima had disappeared hundreds of years earlier. In despair, he opened the forbidden box, hoping it might return him to the sea palace. A cloud of white smoke rose from the container. Instantly, his hair turned white and his body aged. The years he had escaped returned to him all at once, and he died where he stood. Many variations of the story later appeared. In one version, Urashima transforms into a crane, a bird believed to live for 1,000 years, suggesting that his life continues in another form. Another ancient tale tells of a hero who married the daughter of a sea king while searching for a lost fishhook. The sea king easily found the missing hook and allowed his daughter to follow the hero back to the surface world. When she later gave birth to their child, she asked her husband not to look at her during the moment of birth, because she would return briefly to her true form as a sea creature. Curiosity overcame him, and he broke the promise. Seeing that her secret had been revealed, the sea maiden returned forever to the ocean realm. As time passed, stories of heavenly beings and sea spirits were influenced strongly by ideas from Buddhist and Taoist traditions. Heavenly maidens were imagined floating through the sky, playing music and scattering flowers. Dragon kings ruled magnificent palaces beneath the sea and controlled storms and rain. Mountain immortals wandered through remote landscapes performing strange acts of magic and living beyond the limits of human time. Among the sea spirits, one figure became especially beloved. She was known as Benton, a goddess associated with music, beauty, eloquence, and fortune. Legends described her as both a heavenly maiden and a princess of the dragon realm. Shrines dedicated to her appeared in many beautiful coastal locations. One of the most famous stands on an island in the inland sea, where temple buildings rise above the tide as if floating upon the water. Lanterns glow along wooden corridors, while sacred deer wander across the beach. According to tradition, a powerful warlord once encountered 3 radiant women sailing toward him in a shining boat with a crimson sail. They revealed themselves as divine sisters and promised him success if he restored their shrine. After he fulfilled their request, his power increased greatly, and his family carried the red banner ever afterward. Among the many strange beings described in Japanese folklore, one creature is said to live in the sea and yet stand slightly below the mighty dragon spirits in rank. This being is known as Ningyo. In appearance, it resembles a mermaid. Its head is that of a woman with flowing hair, while the lower body is shaped like a fish. Stories say that this mysterious creature sometimes appears before human beings, not to harm them, but to offer warnings or advice about future events. Legends also claim that pearls are formed from the tears of the Ningyo. One old tale describes a fisherman who once caught such a creature in his net. When he saw its human face and realized what he had captured, he felt pity and released it back into the sea. In gratitude, the creature shed tears that turned into pearls. The fisherman gathered them and filled an entire casket with the shining stones. Another belief connected with this strange being says that its flesh possesses magical power. According to this tradition, anyone who eats a portion of Ningyo meat gains extraordinary longevity and remains youthful for an impossibly long time. Because of this belief, many old stories tell of women who tasted this mysterious food and lived for centuries without aging. Another curious creature, sometimes linked to the sea, is called the shoujo. Although it does not actually dwell beneath the waves, legends say that it comes to Japan from distant lands across the ocean. The shoujo is often imagined as a cheerful and playful spirit associated with drinking. In many ways, it represents the joyful side of life and the pleasures of celebration. Its appearance is distinctive and easily recognized. The shoujo is usually shown with a bright red face that gives it a youthful and mischievous expression. Long red hair flows down its back, almost to its feet. In its hand, it often carries a ladle used for serving rice wine. It dresses in brilliant garments decorated with red and gold patterns. When it appears in art or storytelling, it is frequently shown dancing with exaggerated movements, like a performer in a lively festival. Although detailed stories about this creature are rare, images of 2 or 3 shoujo together often appear in paintings or small sculptures. Their lively dance is sometimes performed in theatrical tradition, while singers praise the joy of music and the pleasures of drink. Moving away from sea spirits, another group of supernatural beings entered Japanese imagination, through ideas that arrived from China. These figures are known as the sennin, often described as mountain immortals. They represent an ideal of spiritual freedom that became very popular in East Asian thought. In legend, these beings possess remarkable abilities. They can fly through the sky, create magical objects, or summon animals that appear from nowhere. Some are said to ride across the surface of the sea or travel enormous distances in moments. Yet their most important characteristic is not their magic, but their complete independence from ordinary human worries. The sennin live beyond the reach of time, illness, and death. They are often imagined as reclusive sages who withdrew from society to live among remote mountains. In their peaceful solitude, they are said to have discovered harmony with the natural world. In this sense, they represent a vision of the ideal human being who has escaped the burdens of ordinary life. Stories about such figures began during a long period of political chaos in ancient China. During those troubled centuries, many educated men abandoned public life and retreated into the mountains to pursue quiet reflection. Over time, these hermits were remembered in popular imagination as beings who had achieved supernatural wisdom and even immortality. When these ideas reached Japan, they found eager listeners. During periods of social instability, especially in the medieval era, the dream of escaping the world and living peacefully in the mountains held strong appeal. Tales of mountain immortals became popular and were told widely among the people. Among the most famous figures in this tradition is a mysterious old man sometimes called the Prime Man of the East. Though he appears ancient, he never grows older. In his hand he carries a peach, a symbol of endless vitality and renewal. His presence suggests the return of spring and the constant rebirth of life in nature. Opposite him, in the mythic geography of the world, stands the Queen Mother of the West. She is imagined as a beautiful woman who lives on a high plateau close to the heavens. Surrounded by a court of youthful attendants, she rules over a realm where immortals gather and where magical peaches grant eternal life. Other immortals are closely connected with particular plants or animals. One female spirit is associated with the plum blossom, a flower admired for its delicate fragrance and its ability to bloom at the very end of winter. This immortal is said to wander among the trees at night, especially when the moonlight shines across the branches. Another immortal rides upon a white crane while playing music on a stringed instrument. The crane itself symbolizes long life and spiritual freedom. A different figure is linked to the chrysanthemum flower. In legend, he appears as an eternal youth who lives beside a mountain spring surrounded by blooming chrysanthemums. The water flowing from this place is believed to possess healing power. One of the most unusual immortals is known as the Master of Toads. He is said to command countless toads and even ride through the air, upon them, as if they were flying mounts. Many of these figures originally belonged to Chinese mythology, but Japan eventually produced its own mountain immortals as well. Among the most famous was a legendary ascetic, known for practicing severe spiritual discipline among remote mountain peaks. Stories claim that he possessed the power to command spirits and supernatural creatures. According to one tale, he ordered spirits and demons to help him construct a stone bridge connecting two distant mountains. One mountain spirit refused to appear because it was ashamed of its hideous appearance. Angered by the disobedience, the ascetic trapped the spirit within a cave where it was forced to remain forever. The same figure was later accused by government officials of practicing forbidden magic and was sent into exile. During this time, many stories circulated, describing extraordinary feats he performed. In popular imagination, he eventually became one of the great mountain immortals, and statues of him can still be seen in certain caves, where he is shown seated calmly with a staff in his hand. However, legends often warn that immortals can lose their powers if they give in to ordinary human desires. One story tells of a powerful hermit who had gained the ability to perform miracles after long years of discipline. At one time, he captured a group of dragon spirits and locked them inside a cave. Because these dragons controlled the rain, the land soon suffered from terrible drought. The king of the region realized what had happened and devised a plan. He sent a beautiful woman to the mountains where the hermit lived. The ascetic, who had spent years in isolation, was captivated by her beauty. When she offered him wine, he accepted it. As he drank, his supernatural powers gradually faded. The imprisoned dragons escaped into the sky, and the long-awaited rain finally returned to the land. Another famous story tells of an immortal who could fly freely through the air. One day, while gliding high above the mountains, he happened to look down and saw a woman washing clothes in a river. The sight of her bare white feet shining in the water distracted him. In that moment of desire, his magical power vanished, and he fell back to the earth. Though he survived the fall, he never regained the abilities he once possessed. Despite these warnings, belief in mountain immortals continued for centuries. Some people even attempted to imitate their way of life. They avoided cooked food, lived on simple plants, wandered through mountains, and bathed in cold streams. A few believed they had already gained supernatural powers. One man even convinced himself that heavenly clouds had descended to carry him away. When he leaped from a high cliff expecting to be lifted into the sky, he instead fell to his death. Even so, figures like these continued to fascinate ordinary people, and stories about them circulated widely. In art and literature, the immortals were often imagined gathering together in a peaceful land hidden among mountains. This place was described as a quiet paradise, where tall pine trees grew and wide terraces overlooked beautiful landscapes. Here, the immortals met not to rule or fight, but simply to enjoy conversation, compose poetry, play music, and contemplate the mysteries of nature. Unlike the brilliant paradises described in certain religious traditions, this world was not dazzling or supernatural in appearance. Instead, it resembled an ideal landscape of mountains, rivers, and forests, where life moves slowly and peacefully. Paintings depicting this tranquil realm became very popular in Japan. They inspired poets, artists, and philosophers who dreamed of escaping the noise and troubles of ordinary life. Many scholars attempted to recreate this peaceful atmosphere in their own gardens and homes. Quiet gatherings devoted to poetry, conversation, or tea ceremonies were often inspired by this vision of the immortals' world. During the late medieval period, ideas about mountain immortals blended with local traditions and other religious influences. Over time, a new group of popular deities appeared, known collectively as the Seven Gods of Good Fortune. These figures came from many different cultural traditions, but were eventually combined into a single cheerful group associated with prosperity, happiness, and long life. One of them is Ebisu, a smiling fisherman who carries a fishing rod and a large sea bream, a fish considered a symbol of good luck. Another is Daikoku, a joyful figure standing upon sacks of rice. He carries a magic mallet and a bag filled with treasure, representing abundance and prosperity. Bishamon appears as a powerful warrior who protects the righteous and defeats evil spirits. He is often shown holding a small shrine, symbolizing wealth and good fortune. Benton, the only woman in the group, is associated with music, beauty, and artistic talent. She often holds a musical instrument and is linked with the mysterious powers of water. Fukurokuju is an ancient sage recognized by his unusually long forehead. He represents wisdom, prosperity, and longevity. Jurojin is another symbol of long life. He is often shown walking slowly with a staff and accompanied by a deer, an animal associated with endurance and health. The final figure is Hotei, a cheerful monk with a round belly who carries a large sack filled with gifts. He is usually surrounded by laughing children and represents contentment and generosity. Long ago, in the province of Setsu, there lived a young woman whose beauty was spoken of throughout the region. People called her the Maiden of Unai. Many men came hoping to win her love, but she showed interest in none of them. Suitors arrived one after another, each certain that his devotion would succeed where others had failed. Yet the maiden remained distant and unmoved by their attention. Because of this belief, love stories often carried a deeper emotional tone. Passion was not seen merely as a temporary experience, but as something that could bind souls across different lives and different worlds. Romance, therefore, became a powerful theme in literature, poetry, and storytelling. One of the greatest works created during this cultural flowering told the story of a noble prince whose life was filled with complex love affairs. The prince was admired for his beauty, intelligence, and charm, and his adventures formed the centre of countless stories. Yet the appeal of these tales did not lie in dramatic action or complicated plots. Their power came from the subtle way they connected human emotion with the beauty of the natural world. Different women who appeared in the prince's life were often associated with particular seasons or landscapes. One woman represented the freshness and joy of spring, her story unfolding through gentle and hopeful moments. Another lived within a storm of jealousy and sorrow, her life shaped by passion and resentment. Through such characters, the stories explored many shades of human feeling. These tales became enormously influential. Poets quoted them, painters illustrated their scenes, and playwrights adapted their themes for the stage. Over time, the characters felt so real to audiences that people spoke of them almost as if they had truly lived. In later centuries, dramatic performances were created that retold these stories in a distinctive theatrical style. These performances combined music, poetry, and dance rather than conventional dialogue. Actors moved slowly and symbolically across the stage, while singers and musicians created an atmosphere of quiet emotion. The result was less like ordinary drama and more like a lyrical meditation on memory and longing. Among the famous figures associated with these romantic traditions was a celebrated woman, renowned for both her beauty and her poetry. During her youth, many admirers sought her affection, yet she eventually withdrew from court life and lived as a solitary wanderer. Stories later portrayed her as a tragic figure whose pride in her beauty had led to loneliness, regret. In paintings, she is sometimes shown as an aged woman sitting beside a wooden memorial marker, remembering the vanished days of her youth. A short poem often associated with her speaks of flowers fading in the rain, while love disappears unnoticed. The image suggests how quickly beauty and affection can vanish with time. Another well-known romantic figure was a poet whose life was filled with passionate relationships. One story describes a girl he had loved since childhood. When they were young, they often stood beside a well together. Leaning on the wooden rim, they looked into the water where their reflections appeared side by side. Years later, the poet fell in love with another woman and abandoned his childhood companion. The girl returned alone to the well where they had once met. Looking down at the water, she remembered the happy past and composed verses expressing the pain of her loss. The setting of that forgotten well later became the scene of a dramatic performance. In the story, a wandering monk arrives at the place and encounters the spirit of the deserted woman. She appears briefly, recounts her sorrow, performs a mournful dance, and then disappears as dawn approaches. Another story tells of a woman whose deep love continued even after death. Her restless spirit appeared during an autumn night to a travelling monk who had come to visit the place where she once lived. The calm beauty of the night contrasted sharply with the suffering of the ghost, whose longing for the man she loved still bound her to the world of the living. Yoshitsune, once known in his youth as Ushiwaka, became one of the most celebrated warrior figures in Japanese tradition. Countless stories gathered around his name, and beside him in many of those tales stood Benkei, his fierce and loyal companion. Together they crushed the power of the Taira in battle, and together they faced the dark turn of fortune that followed. After victory came suspicion. Yoshitsune's fame grew so great that it stirred resentment in the heart of his own elder brother, the military ruler who should have protected him. From that jealousy came exile, pursuit, and finally tragedy. Later generations never forgot the image of Benkei making his last stand, remaining upright beneath a storm of arrows as enemies closed in around him. That final scene, like so much in Yoshitsune's life, left a deep mark on popular memory. Yet among all the legends tied to his name, one episode is enough to show why his story endured with such force. After the campaigns that shattered the Taira clan, Yoshitsune remained for a time in the imperial capital. His victories had made him famous, but fame in a divided court could be as dangerous as defeat on the battlefield. Whisperers fed his brother's fears, and suspicion turned into open hostility. At last, Yoshitsune was forced to flee the capital under sudden attack. He made his way to Yoshino, a place admired for its mountain beauty and its spring blossoms, but even there he found no peace. Agents sent against him stirred the local warrior monks to violence, and the exile had to fight again while already stripped of security and rank. Through these hardships he was not alone. Benkei remained with him, as did several faithful followers and the woman closest to his heart, Shizuka. The fall from glory was made even more painful by the loss of trusted men who died for him in the confusion of escape. At times, the danger grew so extreme that Yoshitsune had to conceal his identity, dressing as a wandering mountain priest and moving with only a handful of companions. The contrast between the brilliant commander of great victories and the hunted fugitive slipping through dangerous roads gave later storytellers some of their most moving material. His grief over lost retainers, his sorrowful separation from Shizuka, and the loneliness of his wandering became central parts of his legend. What followed was not a return to triumph, but a long descent into misfortune. From the moment of exile, Yoshitsune's life became a chain of reversals, disappointments, and desperate struggle. In the end, he met death not in glory, but in defeat. Even so, his image did not diminish. If anything, the suffering made him greater in the eyes of later generations. He remained brave when fortune deserted him, dignified when stripped of power, and steadfast when surrounded by betrayal. That is why he came to stand above other heroes of Japan, whether drawn from history or imagination. Few lives offered such a powerful mix of military brilliance, romance, sorrow, and sudden turns of fate, and no other figure combined those elements with the same lasting emotional force. The centuries that followed saw the growth of a warrior society shaped by feudal rule. Conflict between rival houses became a constant feature of life, and out of that world came a great flood of heroic storytelling. Many of these stories were rooted so deeply in real events that they belong more to history than to legend. Two ideas drove many of these tales more than any others: daring adventure and the demand for vengeance. Stories of dangerous quests, monstrous opponents, and lonely acts of courage became especially popular. Tales of revenge were equally powerful, often centered on loyalty to family and the duty to answer blood with blood. One of the best known told of two young brothers who, after losing their father, overcame one obstacle after another to kill the man responsible. The event itself belonged to history, but it stirred such deep sympathy that it passed into the emotional life of the people and remained there as part of shared tradition. Alongside such stories stood many others that seemed to have been shaped purely by imagination, yet gained a place just as secure in popular memory. Among all these legends, none became more beloved than the tale of Momotaro, the Peach Boy. His story spread so widely that nearly every child knew it, and his name came to represent courage, cleverness, and cheerful determination. The tale begins with an old couple living quietly near the mountains. One day, the old woman was washing clothes in a stream when she saw a large peach floating down with the current. She brought it home, and when the old man opened it, a healthy baby boy appeared from within. The couple, who had no child of their own, raised him with affection. He grew into a spirited young man, eager for action and drawn toward the world beyond his home. When he came of age, Momotaro decided that an ordinary life would not satisfy him. He wanted a worthy challenge, and he chose to sail to the island of demons, a place feared for its savage inhabitants. Before he left, his mother prepared sweet dumplings for the journey. Carrying these provisions, he set out alone, but his solitude did not last. Along the road, a dog approached and begged for one of the dumplings. Momotaro shared his food, and the dog joined him. Later, a monkey did the same, and then a pheasant. In this way, the young hero gathered a small but loyal company, not through force, but through generosity. Together they crossed the sea and reached the demon's stronghold. What followed was an attack swift enough to become legendary. The monsters, feared from afar, could not resist the energy and cooperation of the strange little band that had come against them. Momotaro and his companions defeated the demons and seized the treasures they had stored away. Laden with riches, they returned home in triumph. The old couple welcomed the boy with overwhelming joy, and his animal companions celebrated with such delight that the ending became one of the happiest in all heroic folklore. Another famous warrior tale carries the listener out over the waters of Lake Biwa and into a world where the human and supernatural meet. Its hero is Tawara Toda, a fighter remembered not only for his courage but for the magical gifts he later received. One night, while crossing the long bridge at Satire near the lake's outlet, he came upon a monstrous serpent stretched across his path. Most men would have fled at once, but Toda walked forward calmly, passing the creature as though it were nothing more than a fallen branch. That fearless act was only the beginning. Later that night, a young woman came to his home and revealed the truth. She was the daughter of the Dragon King, and the serpent on the bridge had been her transformed shape. She had tested him and found in him the courage she needed. Her people, she said, were being slaughtered by a gigantic centipede, and she asked whether he would fight the monster. Todi accepted immediately. He returned to the bridge and waited in the darkness, watching lightning flash around the mountain across the lake. Then he saw two burning points in the night, bright as polished mirrors. They were the creature's eyes. He drew his bow and fired. The first arrow struck but had no effect. The second failed as well, glancing away as if it had struck metal. Then Toda remembered that the centipede could be killed by poison, and with quick resolve he wet his third arrow with saliva before releasing it. This time, the shot found its mark. The giant creature collapsed lifeless, and the threat hanging over the dragonfolk came to an end. By skill and composure, Toda had done what brute force alone could not. On the following night, the Dragon Maiden returned, this time in gratitude. She invited Toda to visit the palace beneath the waters of the lake, where he was welcomed with splendor and entertained with every delicacy the underwater realm could offer. When the time came for him to leave, the Dragon King rewarded him with 3 treasures: a bale of rice that could never be exhausted, a roll of silk that provided endless clothing, and a bell of ancient origin that had long rested beneath the lake. Toda later offered the bell to a temple on the shore, but he kept the other miraculous gifts. They served him well in the adventures that followed, and because of the inexhaustible rice bale, people came to know him as Tawara Toda, the Lord of the Rice Bale. With tales like these, heroic legend in Japan moved easily between history and wonder. Some stories were shaped by real battles and political betrayals, others by demons, in dragon palaces and impossible births, yet all of them carried the values of the age that treasured them. Courage mattered, but so did loyalty. Cleverness mattered, but so did gratitude. Victory in battle could make a hero famous, yet suffering, endurance, and fidelity in times of ruin could make that hero unforgettable. That is why figures like Yoshitsune, Momotaro, and Tawara Toda remained alive in memory, long after the worlds that produced them had vanished. They were more than characters in old stories. They became lasting images of what bravery, sorrow, adventure, and honor looked like in the imagination of a nation. He ran home at once and told his mother what had happened. She listened carefully and then explained that, early that morning, she had noticed a cat behaving in a very strange way. It had seemed to be counting his arrows one by one, and the sight had unsettled her enough to warn him to carry one more than usual. Only then did the mystery become clear. The cat had been using a mirror as a shield, turning aside the first 10 shots, because it believed that 10 arrows were all he had. When the last of those had been spent, it relaxed its guard. That single moment of confidence cost it its life, and the 11th arrow found its mark. Among the many animal stories told to children, one of the most striking is the tale of the fox cub who avenged its mother after a badger betrayed her. The story begins in a forest that had been nearly emptied by hunters. So much killing had taken place that only 3 creatures remained there: a badger, a mother fox, and her young male cub. Hunger pressed on all of them. Their stores were gone, prey had become scarce, and desperation forced them to survive by cunning rather than strength. In that misery, the fox and the badger devised a strange way to secure food. The badger pretended to be dead, while the fox transformed itself into the shape of a human being and carried the motionless body to market. The trick worked. The false corpse was sold, money changed hands, and food was bought with the payment. Later, the badger slipped away and returned safely to the forest, where the two shared what had been gained. For a short time, the plan saved them. But once those provisions were exhausted, they decided to repeat the scheme. This time, the roles were reversed. The fox lay still like a dead animal, and the badger took it to be sold, But the badger had no intention of remaining loyal. Wanting all the food for itself, it quietly warned the buyer to make certain the fox was truly dead. Suspicious of being tricked, the man struck and killed the fox for real. The badger then went back alone with the food and kept every bit of it, refusing even the smallest share to the hungry cub. The young fox understood exactly what had happened. Its mother hadn't died by accident or misfortune. She had been betrayed for the sake of a meal. From that moment on, the cub thought only of revenge. Instead of attacking at once, the cub chose patience. One day it approached the badger with an innocent face and a respectful tone. It remarked that both foxes and badgers were famous for their skill in magic, yet nobody seemed to know which of the two was more accomplished. Why not hold a contest, it suggested, and settle the matter properly? The badger laughed at the proposal, amused by what it took to be childish pride, but agreed. In truth, it was already thinking of how to rid itself of the cub as well. So the two set off together toward the town, each pretending friendship while hiding darker intentions. As they drew near the town, the cub quietly fell behind and disappeared from sight. The badger, seeing no sign of it, stopped near the outskirts and waited. Before long, a grand procession came into view, crossing a bridge with full ceremony. Armed retainers surrounded a noble palanquin, and the entire scene moved with such splendor that it seemed almost unreal. The badger, convinced that this had to be one of the cub's illusions, rushed forward without hesitation. Another well-loved tale, far less grim in tone, though no less ruthless in its conclusion, is the story of the monkey and the crab. A crab once lived beneath a persimmon tree, heavy with ripening fruit. The crab longed to taste the sweet persimmons, but it could not climb. Seeing a monkey nearby, it asked for help. The monkey went up the tree, but instead of sharing fairly, it kept the ripe fruit for itself and carelessly threw the hard, unripe ones down below. One of them struck the crab with such force that it died. From the dead crab came many tiny young crabs, and when they learned how their mother had been killed, they swore to take revenge. The little crabs were too small to confront the monkey alone, so they sought allies. Their helpers were an unusual company: a chestnut, a strip of seaweed, a bee, a wooden pounder, and a rice mortar. Each had a role to play. Together they prepared an ambush inside the monkey's house and waited for the right moment. The plan depended not on strength, but on timing. When the monkey finally returned home and went to the stove to heat water, the chestnut burst from the fire and scorched its face. In pain, the monkey rushed to open a container where soothing paste was kept. But from inside flew the bee, stinging it sharply. Startled and blinded, the monkey stumbled backward, slipped on the seaweed, and crashed to the floor. At once, the pounder and the heavy mortar fell from above and struck it down. Stunned and helpless, the monkey could no longer resist. That was when the crabs rushed in and finished their revenge, cutting the murderer of their mother into pieces. No creature, however, occupies a more powerful place in Japanese folklore than the serpent. Of all animals linked with fear, wonder, and the unseen world, the serpent stands among the most important. Even in later times, many people continued to regard it with deep superstition. A white serpent, in particular, was often treated as a sacred sign of wealth and good fortune, sometimes almost as an object of reverence. Yet the same creature could also appear in stories as a dangerous and vengeful force. It might represent jealousy, lust, hidden power, or the dark transformation of human desire. In some tales, a woman consumed by jealousy is said to become serpent-like in spirit, or even to change into a serpent in body. One story tells of a woman who pursued her fleeing lover across a stream, transforming as she went. Reaching him at last, she coiled herself around the bronze bell where he had hidden and burned through it in her rage. In another story, a warrior withdrew from worldly life and became a monk after witnessing an eerie scene in his own house. Looking at the shadows of his wife and concubine cast upon a paper screen, he saw their hair change into serpents battling each other. That vision convinced him that passion itself could take monstrous form. The serpent was also tied in popular imagination to desire and possession. Many tales speak of serpents becoming obsessed with women, following them relentlessly, or fathering strange children who were partly human and partly marked by something unnatural. In some places, families were even believed to descend from such unions and to remain under the protection of an ancestral serpent. Across the country, lakes and ponds were often said to have a serpent spirit dwelling within them. Sometimes this guardian was imagined as a true snake, sometimes as a dragon-like being, and the line between the two was not always clear. Stories of these water spirits appear again and again in different regions, often changing only in name and setting. Such beings were believed to control rain, storms, and the movement of water itself. In times of drought, offerings might be made along the shore in hopes of gaining their favour. Male serpent spirits were sometimes said to draw women beneath the water, while female ones could take the form of beautiful human women and marry mortal men. They might remain in serpent shape, but many were also thought to possess the ability to become dragons of enormous size and power. One such tale is attached to a monk named Nanzo-bo. He longed, not for wealth or power, but for an impossible future. He wanted to remain alive until the coming of Maitreya, the Buddha of the distant age to come, whose appearance was believed to lie unimaginably far ahead. Human life was too short for such a hope. According to the belief of the time, however, dragons and serpent beings could endure for ages so vast that they seemed almost immortal. Guided by a divine revelation, Nanzo-bo resolved to transform himself into such a being and wait beneath the waters until that future dawned. To accomplish this, he withdrew to the edge of a lake at the foot of a mountain and devoted himself completely to reciting a sacred text. Day after day he continued his discipline, and through the power of that practice he began to lose his ordinary human form. Little by little he changed into a serpent. During this strange life of prayer and transformation, a young woman came to him. She said she had been drawn there by the sound of his voice as he recited the holy words. When he learned who she was, the mystery deepened still further. She was the serpent spirit of the lake itself. She asked to live with him, and he consented. For a time they remained together in the water. Then one day she warned him that another serpent, a male from a nearby lake, had long desired her and would not endure the sight of a rival. The warning proved true. Before long, the other being appeared, and the quiet waters became the scene of a violent struggle. The attacking serpent came with 8 forked heads. Nanzo-bo met him with 9. The sacred scripture he had carried and recited had become part of his power, and each of its roles seemed to take on the form of a living head beside his own. In the battle that followed, Nanzo-bo prevailed. The rival serpent fled in defeat, driven back to its own lake and reduced to weakness. Stories of love and marriage between animals, or between animals and human beings, also held a firm place in traditional storytelling. One of the best-known concerns a fox woman named Kuzu no Ha, who loved a warrior and lived beside him as a wife for many years. The most moving part of that legend is not the marriage itself, but the sorrow of separation when she must finally leave behind the son born from that union. Another story tells of the spirit of an old willow tree taking the form of a woman and marrying a warrior, only to be torn away from him when the tree itself is cut down. In such tales, the central idea is not wonder alone, but the pain of love bound to an impossible fate. A gentler nursery story takes the theme in a lighter direction. This is the tale of the Mouse Wedding. In its simplest version, two young mice are married with all the ceremony of human beings, and the pleasure lies in seeing familiar customs mirrored in tiny creatures. But another version turns the story into a lesson. In that telling, an old couple of mice become so proud of their daughter that they want her to marry someone of the highest possible rank. They seek a husband greater than themselves and approach first the moon, then the cloud, then the wind, each of whom proves less absolute than imagined. In the end, after all their ambition, they marry her to a mouse of their own kind, and the lesson is clear enough. A fitting union rests on equality, not on vain dreams of status. One of the most unusual tales of animal love is the story of the owl and the eagle. An owl named Fukuro lived in one forest and fell deeply in love with a songbird named Uso Dori, who lived elsewhere. Her beauty and voice drew him completely. Before making any move, he consulted his retainers, a crow and a heron, and asked how he might win her favour. They warned him that she had already rejected the suit of a powerful eagle, a proud lord feared by the other birds, and advised him not to pursue so dangerous a desire. But Fukuro ignored their caution and sent a letter instead, entrusted to another bird who carried it to the lady. His message was elegant and full of feeling, and it touched her more than anyone had expected. Her reply was delicate and indirect. She wrote that she was unworthy of such admiration and wished to avoid the jealousy of others, especially that of the eagle. Yet she added that, in a distant time, when flowers bloomed in heaven and fruit ripened on earth, they would meet in the western paradise of Amida. At first, Fukuro took this as a graceful refusal, a promise of reunion only after death. He sank into despair. Then, through the guidance of a deity he worshipped, the hidden meaning became clear. The flowers of heaven were the stars, the fruits of earth were the signs of dawn, and the western paradise was not the next world at all, but a shrine dedicated to Amida on the western slope of a hill. Realizing this, Fukuro rushed there in joy. For a brief moment, the lovers were united. But the other birds soon learned of their meeting and spoke openly of Fukuro's good fortune. Their comments reached the eagle, and jealousy turned quickly into fury. On the next meeting near the shrine, the eagle's followers attacked. Fukuro escaped, but Usodori was killed. The loss shattered him. He put on the robes of a wandering monk and spent the rest of his days moving from place to place in sorrow. That, the story says, is why the owl is so often associated with the lonely groves around temples. Insects appear less often in story than in poetry, music, and painting. But they too have their place in traditional imagination. They may act like tiny spirits, moving among flowers, repaying kindness, or even seeking spiritual release. The grateful bee belongs to this group, and so do tales of fireflies and butterflies that return to those who once showed them mercy. Dragonflies often appear in songs, and one red variety became linked with the return of the dead to places they had once known. Crickets were imagined as warning voices of the coming cold, their songs urging people to prepare for winter. Yet no insect was loved more than the butterfly. The butterfly was treated not merely as a creature of beauty, but as something close to a fairy. Festival dances and instrumental pieces were devoted to it, and dramatic works gave it a full spiritual presence. One such story tells of a wandering monk who arrives in the capital and spends the night in an abandoned palace. It is spring. The air is soft, the moonlight pale, and the place is filled with the memory of vanished elegance. During the night, a woman appears and speaks of the old days, when the palace gardens were full of flowers and the grounds echoed with music and celebration. Then she reveals that she is not human at all, but the spirit of a butterfly. She explains that she delights in moving from blossom to blossom. yet cannot draw near to the plum flower, which blooms too early in the season. Because of that limitation, she seeks spiritual release, hoping the monk will guide her toward enlightenment and harmony with all living things. As he begins to chant sacred scripture, she takes on her true form. She becomes a butterfly dressed in pink, crowned with green, and winged in shifting colours. Then she sings and dances while the monk continues his recitation. The mood changes with the seasons inside the performance. Spring flowers bloom, summer passes, autumn advances, and at last only the pale chrysanthemums remain. Around them, the butterfly turns again and again, moving like a wheel, its dance gradually becoming a symbol of transformation. By dawn, the figure grows fainter, dissolving into the thin light of morning until nothing remains but haze. A final butterfly story carries a quieter emotion. There was once a young man named Sukuni whose whole life revolved around flowers. He planted them, tended them, and loved them above everything else. He married a woman who shared the same devotion, and together they cared for a wide and beautiful garden. A son was born to them, and he inherited that same affection for growing things. Years passed peacefully until the husband and wife died, leaving the son alone with the flowers they had cherished. He devoted himself to the garden even more carefully after their deaths, as though the flowers preserved something of their presence. One spring he noticed 2 butterflies returning day after day, always together, always moving gently among the blossoms. He grew fond of them and made sure they came to no harm. Then one night he dreamed of his parents entering the garden as they had once done in life, admiring the flowers and finally changing into butterflies. When he woke, he hurried outside and saw the same pair once more, floating above the beds of bloom. Then he understood. The butterflies were not merely insects of spring. They were the souls of his father and mother come back to the place they had loved most. From that day forward he fed them with honey and protected them as tenderly as he could. From there, the imagination of old Japan moved naturally from animals to trees and flowers. Plants were never treated as lifeless decoration. They were thought to possess inner being, quiet feeling, and a nature not altogether unlike the human soul. But unlike many animals, they were rarely imagined as sly or cruel. Trees and flowers appeared instead as graceful presences, modest and gentle, often closer to fairies than to beasts. They spoke with one another, loved one another, sometimes loved human beings, and occasionally sought religious wisdom. Even when they quarrelled, their conflicts belonged more to poetry than to savagery. Some stories made plants grateful protectors. Others turned them into companions of saints, spirits, or seasonal rites. In art and verse, they gained personalities so vivid that entire festivals came to be shaped around them. This rich world of floral imagination opened into another landscape altogether, where ancient trees could be treated like divine beings, blossoms could symbolize fidelity or sadness, and the changing year itself could be read through leaves, petals, and scent. Spring in Japan was imagined not simply as a change in weather, but as the arrival of a living presence announced through plants, colour, and scent. Among the first signs of that renewal was the willow. Its long drooping branches suggested elegance, while its pale green leaves seemed to embody the first delicate stirring of life after winter. In poetry and seasonal imagination, willow leaves joined the blossoms of cherry and other flowering trees to create the great fabric of spring, as though the whole landscape had been woven into a single brocade by the spirit who governed the season. The cherry blossom remained the supreme emblem of spring beauty, opening in a brief splendour that was never separated from ideas of fragility and passing time. After the cherry came the peach, valued not only for its flowers but also for the protective force believed to dwell in its fruit. Peach blossoms were closely tied to the girls' festival held in early spring, where they stood for growth, vitality, and the promise of future life. As the season advanced, azaleas brought the spring cycle toward its close. Their blossoms were used to decorate the small shrine prepared for the celebration of the infant Buddha. And so spring ended, not in silence, but in a fusion of flowers, devotion, and ceremony. At almost the same moment, another group of plants began to shift the mood toward summer. Wisteria, Keria, and tree peony appeared in that threshold between seasons, each carrying its own meaning. Wisteria, with its hanging clusters, symbolized brightness and grace, but also the sadness of beauty that does not last. Keria was admired for its vivid yellow, a colour so striking that it often seemed to glow beside streams and garden paths. Its bending branches gave it an air of tenderness, and painters loved to place it near water, where its form could echo the quiet movement of the banks. The tree peony represented magnificent beauty at its fullest, rich and ornamental, a flower that seemed almost too splendid for ordinary life. Other blossoms of the same warm season were given similar associations. The hibiscus became linked with the image of a beautiful woman marked by sorrow, while the hydrangea came to suggest a more changeable kind of charm, captivating yet unstable, lovely yet difficult to trust. In this way, flowers were never treated as mere decoration. They carried personality, temperament, and emotional tone, and each one entered the seasonal imagination with a distinct role. The iris belonged especially to the early summer world. One variety became famous in art through its repeated pairing with a simple bridge of 8 planks, an image that entered the cultural memory through love stories and lyrical scenes. Another kind was closely tied to the festival for boys held in the 5th month. It was believed to protect against harmful forces, and for that reason its leaves were hung from the eaves of houses and placed in bathwater. The act was not merely decorative, it was meant to guard the household, to purify, and to strengthen. In that ritual, the plant became both ornament and shield. Such customs show how closely the natural and the symbolic were linked. A flower could be beautiful, but beauty alone was never enough. It could also defend, bless, heal, or warn. Summer was therefore not imagined through colour only, but through use, meaning, and invisible protection. Among the plants most deeply associated with classical summer feeling was the small fragrant blossom of the Tachibana orange. Its flowers were modest in size, yet their scent carried a strong emotional presence. Tradition connected this tree with a distant southern land imagined as evergreen, a place beyond ordinary time from which it had once been brought by command of a ruler. The fragrance of the blossom was often linked with the call of the cuckoo, and together the two became part of a refined summer atmosphere remembered in poetry. More popular at the level of everyday life were the morning glory and the pale evening flower of the bottle gourd. These plants belonged not to grand legend so much as to intimate seasonal feeling. They opened and faded with a rhythm that made them ideal for reflections on passing beauty, love, and the fleeting nature of warm nights. The evening primrose, another flower of summer, was imagined almost as a companion of the moon, a plant that seemed to gaze upward into the night sky. Even humble grasses and reeds could be transformed by imagination. Yet no summer flower carried greater spiritual weight than the lotus. Introduced together with Buddhism, it came to stand at the very centre of religious symbolism. The lotus rose out of muddy water, but neither its stem, nor leaf, nor flower appeared stained by the impurity below. For that reason it became the perfect image of purity preserved within the world rather than outside it. It also expressed completion and spiritual fulfillment, because flower and fruit appeared together, suggesting that awakening and truth were not separate stages but part of one whole reality. In Buddhist imagination, the paradise beyond death was often pictured as a realm with a sacred pond filled with lotus blossoms of many colours, each giving off an unearthly fragrance. Temple grounds, therefore, often included lotus ponds, not simply for beauty, but as reflections of that higher landscape. Stories told of lotus flowers springing from the graves of devout believers, as though purity had taken visible form from a life of faith. In Buddhist art, enlightened beings were shown seated on lotus thrones, their feet raised above the corruption of the world. Even grave markers could rest upon carved lotus forms, so that the dead themselves might be symbolically placed upon that flower of spiritual release. When autumn approached, its arrival was marked by a different group of plants, known collectively as the seven grasses. These were not the bold blossoms of spring or the radiant flowers of midsummer. They belonged to fields, edges, and open places, and their beauty was quieter, more reflective, and more deeply tied to the soundscape of the season. Blue bellflowers, Petrinia, Eupatorium, Miscanthus, and other wild plants appeared together in the imagination of the people with singing insects. To go out into the autumn fields was therefore to seek not just sight, but sound. The delicate flowers and the thin, plaintive voices of insects belonged to one emotional world. They created the mood of the season together. Miscanthus, in particular, became closely linked with the full moon festival of the 9th month, when offerings were made to the moon and the tall grasses were displayed as signs of autumn's clear beauty. The moon, the grasses, and the cool air formed a complete image, one that still defines the season in Japanese memory. As autumn deepened further, two presences came to dominate above all others: the chrysanthemum and the maple. The chrysanthemum, especially in its white and yellow forms, carried meanings of health, renewal, and long life. It was tied to tales of an eternal spring and a mysterious fountain of youth, where youthful beauty and freshness never faded. Petals and leaves were steeped in rice wine, and the drink was thought to bring blessing, vigour, and longevity. More cultivated varieties of the flower were given poetic names drawn from old stories and legendary figures, until the blossom became not merely a plant, but a whole world of refinement and symbolism. One elegant custom associated with it imagined a winding stream passing through a garden full of chrysanthemums. Small lacquered cups floated along the water, each carrying a poetic theme. Men and women seated beside the stream would take up a cup, drink, and compose a verse on the subject they had drawn. The gathering was playful, artistic, and ceremonial all at once. It united poetry, drink, flowers, and the dream of renewal into a single act of cultivated beauty. The maple, though not a flower at all, was treated almost as one because of the brilliance of its autumn leaves. In poetry and painting, its red colour was linked again and again with the cry of deer heard in the mountains when the season turned cold. That pairing became one of the classic images of autumn melancholy. Sometimes the maple was associated instead with moonlight, especially on frosty nights when the pale brightness of the sky seemed to sharpen the crimson of the leaves. A single leaf drifting down in silence could become the centre of an entire emotional landscape. Autumn in this vision was not harsh or barren. It was luminous, musical, and full of restrained sadness. The turning leaves, the distant animals, and the white moon together shaped one of the most enduring seasonal moods in Japanese tradition. With the maple, the yearly floral cycle effectively came to a close, though winter berries carried a final thread of colour through the colder months until spring began again. This constant attention to plants and flowers also helps explain an important feature of Japanese heraldry. Unlike many European systems, which relied heavily on animals, Japanese family emblems made frequent use of flowers, leaves, and simple plant forms. These designs began in earnest during the age of warfare, when identifying marks were needed on banners, armour, and military equipment. Over time, they became hereditary signs used by families of every rank. Some, like the chrysanthemum of the imperial house, reached back into great antiquity. Others became associated with major warrior lineages and remained powerful symbols long after the age of battle had passed. Their forms were usually simple and highly stylized, built from clean outlines rather than crowded detail. The result was not a crowded shield, but a precise emblem, often taken from the natural world and stripped down to its most recognizable essence. There were only a few stories explaining why a family chose one particular crest over another, but those that did exist reveal the same habit of blending daily life with belief. One family, for example, used the cross-section of a cucumber as its symbol, and claimed that its ancestors had once been protected by the spirit of that plant, after promising never to eat its fruit. A tale like that may seem playful, but it reflects a larger pattern. The natural world was never entirely separate from lineage, worship, or social identity. Flowers could mark the seasons, embody moral feeling, appear in religious imagery, and also stand as the sign by which a household was known. In that sense, the floral calendar was more than a list of seasonal blooms. It was a way of reading the year itself through beauty, memory, ritual, and inherited meaning. That same world of storytelling did not stop with flowers and emblems. It also gave rise to a vast body of moral tales, comic scenes, and satirical episodes. Almost any story could be shaped into a lesson if told with the right emphasis, but animal tales proved especially useful for that purpose. A grateful creature, a foolish human being, a greedy neighbour, or a clever trickster could all become instruments of moral instruction. In Japanese tradition, gratitude stood among the highest virtues. So many stories revolved around repayment for kindness or punishment for selfishness. The results could be sharp, funny, and sometimes cruel. A person driven by greed would end not merely disappointed, but humiliated. A liar would be exposed in a way that made others laugh as much as it warned them. In these tales, human beings were often made to look absurd beside animals, because they let desire, anger, or vanity rule them more completely than creatures supposedly lower than themselves. Buddhist teachers made especially effective use of such material. Romantic tales, ghost stories, and legends of famous beauties could all be retold to show how physical charm fades, how attachment leads to suffering, or how hatred survives from one life into the next. Even stories of proud warriors or vengeful spirits could be reshaped into lessons about karma and delusion. A striking example of moral storytelling tells of a hunter who once shot a monkey and brought the body home, hanging it above his hearth. During the night, he woke to the sound of tiny feet and saw little monkeys gathering near the fire. One after another, they embraced the dead animal, trying to warm it back to life. They were the children of the monkey he had killed. The sight moved him so deeply that he abandoned hunting forever and sought another way to live. The lesson required no sermon. Compassion arose from the scene itself. Other tales taught smaller but still pointed lessons. There was a story of a lazy woman who let her servants do everything and had the habit of pushing used toothpicks into the floor mats rather than throwing them away. Night after night she was disturbed in her bed by tiny figures dressed like little courtiers who danced and sang around her pillow. When her husband finally kept watch and struck at them, the little beings fell dead and were revealed to be nothing more than the hidden toothpicks themselves. The absurd image gave shape to a simple warning. Neglect and laziness create their own torment. A more serious teaching appeared in the familiar tale of several blind men trying to understand an elephant. one touched the leg and insisted the creature was like a tree trunk. Another felt the trunk and declared it to be a snake. Another climbed onto the back and believed it was a hill. Another grasped the tail and thought it resembled a brush. Each spoke from limited truth and mistook that fragment for the whole. Some moral tales grew far more elaborate, mixing spiritual purpose with fantasy on a grand scale. One such story tells of a young nobleman of the court who, after losing his parents, devoted himself to honouring them through music. He played a treasured flute for days as an offering of grief, filial piety, and remembrance. On the 8th day, while he played, a bank of shimmering clouds appeared in the sky, and from it descended a heavenly lord in a golden chariot, surrounded by celestial attendants. The divine visitor declared that the prince's music had reached the highest heaven and that his devotion had moved its ruler. As a reward, the heavenly being offered him the hand of his daughter and promised that she would come to him that very night. The vision seemed almost impossible to believe, but when moonrise came, the clouds returned, and a radiant princess descended from them. Their union was celebrated with music from beyond the human world, and before long the marriage became known throughout the land. Her beauty was so extraordinary that it stirred envy even in the ruler himself. Rather than accept the miracle, he decided to possess it. He began demanding that the prince prove his connection to heaven by performing impossible tasks. He ordered him to bring celestial birds to dance and sing before the court. With the help of his heavenly wife, the prince succeeded. He was then commanded to summon strange, supernatural beings from among the retainers of the heavenly realm. Again he succeeded. Each time the ruler hoped to destroy him through failure, and each time the princess's power overcame the challenge. Still unsatisfied, the ruler demanded something even more dangerous. He ordered the prince to travel to the highest heaven and return with the heavenly lord's signature and seal. To obey, the prince mounted a magical horse, provided by his wife, and rode upward into the divine realm. There he was welcomed magnificently and seated at a splendid feast. Yet during that feast he noticed a starving captive in a nearby chamber, a hideous being bound and miserable. Moved by pity, he gave it some of his own rice. The food restored the prisoner instantly, breaking its chains and sending it roaring back into the sky. Only then did the prince learn the truth. The prisoner was a devil king who had once tried to seize the heavenly princess and had been imprisoned for that crime. The celestial food possessed immense power, and by feeding the captive, the prince had set loose a dangerous enemy once more. Although the act could not be undone, the heavenly lord still gave him the seal and signature, and the prince hurried home. He arrived too late. The released devil had already carried off his wife. In despair, the prince prayed without ceasing to the goddess of mercy, asking for guidance. At last, a vision came, telling him where the captive princess had been taken. He set out by sea, travelled an immense distance, and landed on a harsh southern shore. There, instead of using force, he played his flute. Strange beings of that dark land were drawn by the music and, charmed by its beauty, revealed the place where the princess was hidden. Reaching the palace, he signalled his presence by playing, and she answered from within with her own instrument. The devil king was away, and the guards, lulled by the harmony between the two flutes, failed to resist as the prince placed his wife in a chariot and fled. But the escape was discovered. Drums thundered through the realm, and the devil king raced back in pursuit, with a faster chariot than the one the prince had taken. He was closing in and would surely have overtaken them had heavenly birds not appeared at the crucial moment and driven the devils down into the depths below the earth. The prince and princess returned safely, and later, tradition identified them with divine protectors enshrined in a sacred place, guardians against the malice of dark powers. The story is extravagant, but its underlying values are clear enough. Filial devotion, compassion, prayer, and endurance are rewarded, while envy and force are exposed as ultimately powerless before higher protection. Humour and satire move through this whole tradition as naturally as moral teaching did. In fact, the line between them was often thin. A story might begin as a warning and end in laughter, or begin in laughter and leave behind a serious point. Comic exaggeration was a favourite tool. It exposed vanity, mocked deception, and turned human weakness into entertainment sharp enough to sting. This spirit found a natural home in short comic plays performed between more solemn, dramatic pieces. One famous example centres on a husband who wishes to visit his lover without his jealous wife finding out. To cover his absence, he announces that he is going to spend the night in deep religious meditation and must not be disturbed under any circumstances. To make the deception complete, he orders his servant to sit in his room wrapped in cloth, silently pretending to be him, absorbed in sacred concentration. Convinced that his plan is perfect, the husband leaves for his secret meeting. But his wife is not easily deceived. Suspicion leads her to open the room and test the silent figure seated within. When she pulls away the covering, she finds the servant instead of her husband. At once she sends the servant away and takes his place herself, covering her head and sitting exactly as he had done. When dawn comes, the husband returns, full of confidence and still unaware that his trick has failed. Believing he is speaking to the servant, he begins proudly recounting everything that happened during the night, describing his visit and exposing himself completely. Only when he has spoken enough does the seated figure pull away the cloth. It is his wife. In an instant, the deceiver becomes the fooled, and the comedy lands with perfect clarity. His plan collapses not through grand justice or divine punishment, but through his own carelessness and vanity. That is typical of Japanese comic storytelling at its best. It does not need heavy judgment, it simply lets foolishness reveal itself, and then steps aside while the audience laughs. Another comic play from the same tradition tells the story of three frauds who tried to live off charity by pretending to be helpless. A wealthy man, known everywhere for his generosity, announced that anyone who was blind, deaf, crippled, or otherwise disabled could come to his household and remain there for life under his protection. It was an open invitation shaped by pity and moral duty. Before long, however, the offer reached the ears of a wandering gambler who had lost everything. Seeing in this kindness a chance for easy comfort, he arrived at the rich man's gate, pretending to be blind. The deception worked at once. The master of the house welcomed him in, fed him, and gave him shelter without hesitation. The first impostor soon told two companions of his good fortune. One of them came next, acting the part of a deaf man. The third followed as a cripple. All three were admitted with the same generous treatment, and the rich man, proud to be supporting the unfortunate, made sure they lacked for nothing. For a while the arrangement suited the tricksters perfectly. They enjoyed food, drink, and security, while only having to maintain their false identities. But the ease of that life soon made them careless. Their host had occasion one day to leave home, and before departing he entrusted the three supposed invalids with the care of the storehouses where his wine, silk, and other valuable goods were kept. The moment he was gone, gratitude vanished and greed took over. The blind man saw clearly enough to help himself to the goods. The deaf man heard every cheerful word and burst into song. The crippled one moved without the slightest difficulty. Together, they helped themselves to the wine and began feasting in high spirits. Before long, the storehouses had become the scene of a riotous, private celebration. They drank freely, laughed loudly, and began singing and dancing as though the whole estate now belonged to them. Their enjoyment was so complete that they forgot the one thing that should have mattered most. The master might return at any time. That is exactly what happened. In the middle of their noise and movement, the rich man came back and walked straight into the scene. What he saw was all the proof he needed. His deaf dependent was singing at full voice. The cripple was dancing with perfect energy. The blind man was following the performance closely and clapping in rhythm. For one frozen instant, all three stared at him in horror. Then each of them tried desperately to fall back into the role he had been playing. But the truth was already visible, and there was no recovering from it. Their disguises had collapsed in a single moment of carelessness, and the man whose kindness they had abused drove them all from his house. The comedy rests on exposure, but beneath the laughter lies a familiar warning. Charity without caution invites exploitation, and deception nearly always destroys itself once the deceiver becomes too confident. Another farce centers on drink, appetite, and a failed attempt at intimidation. A reckless young man knew that his aunt kept an excellent supply of sake in her home, and he wanted access to it. He asked her for a cup, but she knew him too well to be fooled by modest requests. 1 cup, in his case, would never remain 1 cup. If she gave in once, the whole store would soon be emptied. So she refused him. The nephew tried persuasion, but she would not bend. Realizing that honest pleading would get him nowhere, he turned to trickery. His plan was simple. If he could frighten the old woman badly enough, she might hand everything over just to be rid of him. So he found a demon mask, put it on, and appeared before her in that terrifying disguise. The effect was immediate. The aunt, confronted by what looked like a devil, became so frightened that she begged the creature to spare her life and promised that it could take all the food and drink in the house. The young man had won more easily than he expected. Still hidden behind the mask, he began to drink. At first he managed the deception carefully, lifting the mask aside each time he needed to put the cup to his lips. But as the sake began to take effect, caution gave way to laziness. The more he drank, the less patience he had for maintaining the act properly. Eventually he pushed the mask partly aside, hanging it from one ear so that he could continue drinking more comfortably, while still presenting its frightening face toward his aunt. He turned one side of his body toward her and drank from the other, believing the trick was clever enough to go unnoticed. But fear had begun to give way to suspicion. The old woman looked more closely, studied his movements, and understood what was happening. Once she realized that the devil was nothing more than her drunken nephew, her terror vanished at once. In its place came anger and indignation. She wasted no time. The false demon was driven out, defeated, not by courage in battle, but by his own inability to keep up the deception once greed and drink took hold of him. Stories like these flourished, especially in a period when public life had become tense, restricted, and full of irritation. In the late 18th century and the early years of the 19th, literary culture in Japan moved through an age of close control. The authorities imposed censorship, moral supervision, and a range of rules governing luxury, conduct, and daily habits. Writers were pushed toward openly moralizing works, and much of what was produced under that pressure became stiff, conventional, and lifeless. Narratives were expected to preach. Fiction was made to look respectable. Imagination had to hide behind correctness. Yet the more literature was forced into obedient forms, the more satire began to gather strength beneath the surface. This atmosphere produced a curious kind of writing. Since direct criticism could be dangerous, many authors disguised their mockery inside fantasy, absurdity, and impossible journeys. Entire invented worlds were used as mirrors for real society. Strange lands, ridiculous customs, and dreamlike adventures allowed writers to say indirectly what could not be spoken plainly. Among the most successful authors of that age was Bakin, whose enormous output included works built around wandering heroes passing through a series of imaginary countries. These journeys were not simply escapist fantasy. They were veiled commentaries on the manners, follies, and contradictions of the age in which they were written. From there, the journey continues into a second strange realm, a land of abundance where wealth is so overwhelming that the people long for poverty. In that country, prosperity has become hateful. Riches are feared rather than desired, and the object of worship is not fortune, but want. Wa. So then passes into other bizarre places, each one exaggerating some human tendency, until it becomes a full social order. There is a land ruled by vanity, where self-display has become a national condition. There is another devoted entirely to old ways, where nothing is ever allowed to change. Another is consumed by indulgence. Another is populated by giants. In each place, the custom or defect of the inhabitants seems ridiculous, yet all of it reflects recognizable habits of ordinary life. Bakin's method is clear. By building worlds upside down, he shows that real society is not nearly as reasonable as it pretends to be. Eventually, one of the giants picks Wa So up, examines him like a curiosity, and drops him again. The fall returns him abruptly to Nagasaki. But his journey does not end there. In a continuation of the story, weary of his ordinary life at home, he longs for more wandering and again goes out to sea. This time, a tortoise appears and becomes the vehicle of his new travels. The first place it carries him to is a land obsessed with cleanliness. Everything there is ordered, polished, and purified to an extreme that soon becomes intolerable. What begins as neatness turns into absurdity, and Wa So is driven away, not by filth, but by the exhausting tyranny of perfection. From there, he is taken to the land of the long-legged and the long-armed, people whose bodies are stretched into exaggerated forms. For generations, they have lived with these deformities without ever thinking to solve the problem through marriage between the two groups. Wa So suggests the obvious remedy that no one among them has considered. Before he can see the result, he moves onward through rough mountain paths and forests to the land of misers, and then across empty plains to the land of the fearless. Elsewhere, he encounters a realm of gold and jewels, where wealth has become an entire environment, and later a country of long-haired and long-eared barbarians, living at a level barely above animal life. The sequence of lands is intentionally excessive, but each one isolates and magnifies some human trait until it becomes the whole logic of a society. One of the strangest episodes comes when Wa So reaches an island inhabited entirely by women. His arrival causes chaos. The women, maddened by the sudden sight of a man, crowd around him in excitement and drag him into the center of their world. He is received at court as an honored guest, but the honor quickly begins to resemble imprisonment. Desire closes around him as effectively as chains, and the more warmly he is welcomed, the less freedom he possesses. He tries to escape, and at that moment the whole sequence collapses. He wakes to discover that the adventure has been a dream. The revelation does not weaken the satire, it strengthens it. A dream is the perfect place for the mind to expose desires, fears, absurd social habits, and the hidden logic of a dissatisfied age. A similar method shapes another imaginary travel tale centered on a dreamer known as Muso. His guide is Urashima, the old legendary voyager who once married a princess of the sea. Urashima gives him a fishing rod and line made of bamboo, and from these Muso fashions a kite strong enough to carry him into the air. With that improbable vehicle, he begins his passage through a series of symbolic lands, each one devoted to a single appetite or condition of life. The first is the land of children. At first, it sounds charming, but the reality is less innocent than it appears. In that country, father, mother, and nurse are revered almost like gods, while the people themselves do little but play, squabble, cry, and demand attention. It is a world built on dependence, noise, and unending immaturity. From there, Muso is carried to a land ruled by lust. The behaviour of its inhabitants is so shameless that he stands in astonishment. In the midst of his confusion, his kite slips away, leaving him stranded. Then Urashima appears again, now living like a hermit among the people of that realm, and provides him with a boat so that he can continue. By sea, Muso reaches the land of perpetual drinking. There, he finds an entire society devoted to intoxication. The atmosphere is festive, careless, and endless, and he himself is more than willing to join in. But the pleasure is interrupted by a sudden attack. A gigantic eagle seizes him and carries him away to yet another country. This time, one ruled by greed. The pattern continues. Muso recovers his kite and flies onward through realms, where lying is the common language, where desire can never be satisfied no matter how much is gained, and where delight itself has become the organizing principle of life. Each place offers a vision of a single human tendency expanded until it becomes a complete civilization. The effect is comic, but also unmistakably critical. These are not merely fantasy landscapes, they are portraits of excess. Every appetite, once turned into a governing law, becomes grotesque. Even pleasure, once detached from limit and balance, begins to look empty. At the end of these travels, Muso reaches a final realm of delight, and there, once more, he finds Urashima, now appearing as the king of that land. Muso enjoys its pleasures until even satisfaction itself begins to lose its edge. Then the old guide sends him back home to Japan. The journey closes not with conquest or revelation in the heroic sense, but with return. That ending matters. These tales are not about discovering truly better worlds. They are about seeing ordinary life more clearly by passing through exaggerated versions of its desires and defects. Beneath their flights of fantasy lies a distinctly earthly purpose. That is what gave such stories their force in an age of pressure and dissatisfaction. When direct criticism narrowed, imagination widened. Writers turned to dream journeys, comic reversals, impossible countries, and absurd social arrangements, because those forms allowed them to speak with freedom while pretending not to. Humour became a disguise for judgment. Satire travelled under the mask of fantasy. Entire worlds were invented so that readers could laugh at them, and in that, laughter recognised their own.